her talk today is going to relate to a book project examining the whole idea of grounds truth, and which is something that anthropologists are interested in, but not necessarily using that expression. So I'll stop talking and hand over to Cindy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, so much for this. I'm going to share my screen right now. And I believe you can see this well.
Yeah, fine.
Absolutely, great. So hi, everyone. I am Cindy Lin. Thank you for joining me today. And thanks also to David and Thomas and Rebecca, who I've just met, for inviting me to give a talk at the Oxford Digital Ethnography Group Seminar Series, and for all the work you've put into convening today's event, despite technical difficulties. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape people, or present-day New York City. And I want to start by acknowledging their elders present, past, present, and emerging. Today, I'll give a brief preview into my book project, which David has kindly introduced, which examines the shifting political and scientific category of ground truth. In particular, I aim to elaborate on the labor of geospatial data technicians and how they approach the practice of ground truth in machine learning. The term ground truth has been used and popularized by the remote sensing community for the past half-century and has spread across the forestry, mining, and resources industries. It aims to solve the following problem. How can you be certain that a remote measurement of an object, for example, a satellite image of an oil palm tree, is equivalent to the real object on the ground? Said otherwise, ground truth is the evidence that maintains equivalence between remote observations and empirical measurements on the ground. The term has spread across disciplines, notably in machine learning, to train and supervise predictive models. For the purposes of the talk today, machine learning refers to the idea that prediction models can learn from data, identify patterns, and generalize results to other data sets. Whereas deep learning is a class of machine learning algorithms, and more famously represented by neural networks. Sorry. More historical practices of ground truth suggest that human interpretation can be used to evaluate the accuracy of what's observed at a distance. In the instance of machine learning, ground truth is applied to assess the accuracy of a predicted output with your training data. For this talk, I centered the role of ground truth in geospatial mapping and how this practice has recently started to incorporate machine learning. I draw from ethnographic fieldwork in Indonesia with state and contracted geospatial data technicians and data scientists who are tasked to remap the nation. These technicians are trained to survey landscapes to ensure maps produced by satellite and light imaging infrastructure correctly correspond with what's on the ground. Much of this surveying work is manual and intuitive in practice. To achieve ground truth, data technicians undertake in situ measurements, which involves an array of activities such as surveying, drawing, field observation, and practical mathematics, all of which builds on field knowledge and experience. Because of this, the work of data technicians is often regarded as a potential source of error. But data technicians in Indonesia and elsewhere continue to embrace intuition and field experience to ensure accuracy. In manual mapping, the data technician merges this array of practices and perspectives into one synoptic image, the map. The remote measurement is made to match the object on the ground. What my ethnographic research documents is that when machine learning is incorporated into these mapping techniques, it's applied to formalize the technician's intuition into a step-by-step classification procedure for predictive map-making models. What should be a familiar story here is that while technicians are capable of subjective judgment, computers aid in objective and predictive measurement. The intuition of technicians now is encoded to make an exact map. There are hence important differences being established between manual mapping and mapping with machine learning. The former relies on assessing the accuracy of maps according to ground collected data, where a sample-based approach allows a careful interpretation of specific areas of a map. The latter also relies on comparing classification results to additional ground truth information, except that ground truth in machine learning operates at a third order remove from ground to pixel to points. I'll explain this distinction later in this talk. This talk makes two arguments. First, it shows how the use of machine learning and environmental mapping is not just a mechanical attempt to replicate parts of human expertise, but also an account of how domain fields, such as the environmental sciences and cartography, are being rearranged in a hierarchy of professional expertise. This rearrangement has already made headway in the practice of machine learning, where a reduced dependency on human technicians who conventionally label and annotate data is explicitly promoted by computer scientists. Second, and perhaps more speculatively, the automation of mapping has installed a new way of knowing and governing the environment based on an ascending order of abstraction, even as machine learning imports the legitimacy of direct witnessing through the language and practice of ground truth. I'll begin this talk by first discussing how state scientists aim to narrow down and mitigate sources of error committed by geospatial data technicians in Indonesia. Second, I'll briefly discuss recent efforts to integrate machine learning into mapping. And lastly, the talk ends with key insights into how data scientists transform how we relate to the world and how this pertains to ground truth. In pursuit of a zero-error map. There are three main ways of rendering forest knowledge into maps. The first was shown to me by Munir, a 23-year-old high school educated data technician hired by a private geospatial mapping company in Bandung, an urban provincial capital on the island of Java, Indonesia, to produce topographic maps. He is one of a team of technicians working under subcontracts from the National Mapping Agency to draw squares and rectangles around vast swaths of building and property across the archipelago. Sitting with Munir, I noticed him staring at pixels instead of satellite images. Scaled to 1:25,000, Munir uses his mouse to quickly click and draw a parameter around what I learned are roofs. The roofs are located in Temajuk, a coastal city on the island of Kalimantan, a region that has witnessed the world's fastest forest clearing rates since 2012, as the oil palm sector has expanded across rural Indonesia. I asked Munir why not zoom in, thinking this will ensure his clicks are made with more precision so that nothing is missed. He told me, my boss wants us to work fast. He then explains that zooming in will give him and his colleagues too much content to work with. Even if state agency scientists demand that every building is drawn, his supervisors are afraid that technicians will interpret too much. Arid mean in their office facilities, on their computers and software, counts for a pool of technicians paid far too little to meet the agency's ambition for an archipelago to be remapped. During regular 3-month-long field surveys to plantation frontiers like Temajuk, Munir and his colleagues cross-referenced the maps they plotted in the office. The exploited terrain poses a danger to the visiting technicians as they tread on eroded and restricted hills, succumb to dislocated knees, and negotiate diffuse threats of death and injury. This work is not easy. Most of them are paid 3 million rupiah, which is about US 200 USD monthly, 4 times below their average income in Bandung. Munir shrugged when I asked about his wages, reasoning that maps are crucial for Indonesia's pembangunan, which in English means development, an ever-shifting ideology that has haunted the nation-state since its plans for self-sufficiency began in the 1950s. Yet Munir and his fellow technicians insisted that opportunity resides in their desk work and field surveys, as direct participants in state forestry protection. The technicians' remediation of pixels provide this lower-class man migrants from rural Indonesia to urban Bandung, a mobility and positionality otherwise out of reach. The remapping project emerged from an earlier incident in December 2010, when former Indonesian administration compared two conflicting maps of Papua Island. The two forest maps showed primary forests of different sizes and boundaries. Researchers attributed this error to different forest classifications and mapping methods. To ameliorate this error, the administration hired teams of earth scientists and geospatial data technicians like Munir to accelerate the remapping of Indonesia's 17,500 islands. Since 2016, this acceleration also included a suite of data science techniques and remote sensing data to speed up the remapping process. State scientists and the National Mapping Agency believe that these new techniques and data could remove two errors typically committed by data technicians: positional errors and attribute errors. Positional errors are inaccurate coordinates of drawn boundaries, and attribute errors are misclassified features, names, and descriptions on maps. The operation of reducing errors practiced by data technicians was made clear to me when we were taught how to see at the office in Bandung. Working through a montage of green and brown, Munir commented, quote, "When the brown pixel changes into a green pixel, what you see is the age of a forest and the beginnings of a house. You try your best to draw a square, but always a little forest near the house will escape," end quote. His earlier trace was returned in red, marked as incorrect by the National Mapping Agency. Quote, "They want us to draw every house, but I can hardly see them without zooming in. And if I zoom in, I'll never finish this map in time. I'll never be paid," end quote. Munir agonized over the deadlines set by the National Mapping Agency. He has spent hours determining which pixel makes the cut. Perhaps drawing this green pixel matches the vegetation nearby. Perhaps adding in a brown pixel will result in more property for the house owner. Classifying a single pixel also meant measuring how much area it occupied. Munir's classifications contribute to a single base map of Indonesia, a standardized reference for other government ministries to further distinguish forest classes into, for instance, primary and secondary forests. Hence, if Munir classified, say, 20 pixels as forests, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Indonesia will use the same pixels to further classify and map distinct forest classes. Munir was afraid to commit an attribute error, given that the international scientific community and environmentalists worldwide have testified against the Ministry of Environment and Forestry for doctoring national forest maps, mostly to reflect a higher estimate of total forest count. Munir drawn images according to a stringent mapping standard. For maps greater than 1:25,000, the tolerance for error is 0.8 millimeter on the scale of a map. A slight inclusion of half a pixel into a forest class can be regarded as inaccurate. If technicians made small-scale maps of Indonesia, they will classify batches of pixels. But because they were making large-scale maps, their classifications had to be accurate to the millimeter. They had to classify pixel by pixel. In cases where two different landscape classes, such as forest and field, are found within a single pixel, technicians will coordinate with their colleagues to decide which class the pixel belonged to. All the while, they're reminded that an extra pixel adds at least 5 meters to the total calculated area of any land feature, posing a serious challenge to Indonesia's mapping agency in their bid to reach for zero-error mapping. In addition to attributional errors, technicians have to resolve positional errors during field surveys. This involves surveying points that are randomly selected by state scientists and validating the land class, coordinates, and names of these places. Surveys also included patient consultation with village leaders on where public facilities are located. In 2017, we followed Munir on a field survey to search for 3 points plotted on a satellite image of Tamajuk that had been taken earlier in 2015. We had to confirm the land class of these 3 points. Munir told me that while surveyors like himself had to carry theodolites and heavy survey equipment a few years ago, their supervisor, one of the first Indonesian remote sensing scientists trained in Purdue University in Indiana, insisted that a GPS navigator and adequate field experience were enough. Halfway into our journey, we got lost into the thick of Borneo's forest, dew, and sludge. Munir's navigator stopped working. His GPS point was moving wildly with every step we took. Local residents had earlier warned us that we were already trespassing into the concession areas of a German timber logging company. We would be in grave danger if we spotted. Munir refused to stop his search and returned to camp. Quote, I have to find this point. The mapping agency wants to know if this is a forest or a field. I don't want to delay our team. End quote. We continue. Munir finally paused at a clearing with taller trees on either side of the field. We all sighed in relief. But the clouds were getting heavier. We did not want to get lost. Our guide told us to get out quickly. At the very moment where we thought we were a step closer to the truth, Munir's navigator received a signal again. We were further away from the point plotted by Jakarta's state scientists. The right location was across a creek. Worried for our safety, Munir marked that we were where we were on his navigator, mumbling, quote, this would do for now, end quote. When technicians had to simultaneously focus both on the leaves and forests, technicians showed how they tried to overcome the very human limitations inherent in the making of an accurate map. From pixel to point. So far, I've talked about how forest maps were made by data technicians whose detail-obsessed classification was matched by their ability to survey landscapes. The second was based on the precision of points produced by remote sensing technology called light detection and ranging data, or LiDAR. LiDAR comprises three features: intensity values, elevation values, and a return number, recorded from a remote sensing device fitted usually to an airplane or satellite. These values are compiled into a 3D data point cloud that you see on the screen, which is unlike a flat 2D pixelated satellite image, emphasizing features that can't be observed from plain sight. Jakarta, July 2018. I'm sitting in front of a laptop opened by Faisal, an Indonesian civil servant and trained geographer working for the National Mapping Agency, 1 year after my field survey with Munir. Further contrasting the point cloud to a pixel, he told me that LiDAR can help technicians to act on their intuition and map faster. Quote, unlike a point cloud, which intuition would tell you to join together based on the proximity of dots, a single pixel gives too much information. Pixels make an operator imagine too much, end quote. The role of the LiDAR point cloud here is not to replace a technician's work in mapping. Rather, it centered the technician's intuition as necessary for reducing the time required for mapping. Faisal defined intuition as an immediate comprehension of the landscape through the clarity of neighboring LiDAR points. Instead of scanning an image, deliberating over a pixel, and long surveys of the terrain, technicians map purely through intuition. Intuition here was how a map can be made faster. Faisal explained further how intuition can be exploited to make maps in a short time. First, from an aerial satellite imagery, technicians are now able to see through forest canopies. LiDAR could penetrate the gaps of forest branches and leaves to spot a road, river, or building that lay underneath. Second, technicians could use the elevation value of each LiDAR data point to classify features according to mapping standards. Since each LiDAR point had the elevation value of any object, as you can see on the screen, is coded by different colors. Technicians could refer then to the height of trees and confirm that a dense plot of trees that he or she was looking at in the satellite image was indeed a forest. For instance, in Indonesia, forest cover is defined as an area of trees with more than 5 meters in height, more than 30% canopy cover, and excludes plantations such as oil palm. Hence, a technician no longer scanned imagery, To make decisions on what should be included, they correlated elevation values with mapping standards and the surrounding context of any mapped object. Despite the use of numbers to aid in intuition, technicians were tasked instead to smooth the elevation values of the LiDAR point cloud to make a good digital elevation model. Raw elevation models made from LiDAR have minor variations in noise, and it was the job of technicians to smooth this out. Back in Bandung, Munir told me that he no longer stared hard at pixels. Instead, he clicked and dragged his mouse to highlight a cluster of data points, average the elevation values, and erase outstanding ones. Instead of allowing technicians to act on their intuition, technicians were tasked to do the repetitive work of data cleaning and processing. Seized by frustration, Munir felt he was completing menial tasks. Quote, "A machine needs to do my job," end quote. He looked at me from his screen. "It's an inefficient use of my time." While the smoothing out of point cloud was previously automated, the National Mapping Agency insisted that technicians manually average elevation points this year. The use of LiDAR in national maps was new, so state scientists were concerned that any errors made with automation cannot be easily identified and corrected. With technicians, such contingencies can be managed and controlled. The prospect of automating mapping motivated groups of practitioners in remote sensing science and cartography to articulate their beliefs about the nature of mapping, the characteristics of human thought, and the nature of computers. One of Munir's supervisors confirmed that technicians have, quote, "hands and eyes that are meant to work fast without thought," end quote. Worded in this fashion, technicians working with LiDAR are perceived to be intuition engines, even as I've shown how their classification and data cleaning work are mindful and effortful. The alleged mindlessness of technicians was made apparent to me one day when Munir's supervisor hired geography graduates to interpret and lightly mark out rice fields on satellite images, leaving the work of precise outlining to technicians. In this way, experts regarded technicians' decision to make an exact cut across pixels as a mere mechanical act, while the point of identification as an act of knowledge. A different kind of ground truth. The third way of map making, each an additional step away from ground observation, involved incremental assets to encode a set of beliefs about how technicians classify and map lands into predictive models. This referred to the application of deep learning techniques in state map-making contracts. Bayu, a university-educated earth scientist from the National Mapping Agency in Jakarta, has developed a method to transform a 3D LiDAR point cloud into 2D pixel-based images. These images are what Bayu then used to train a fully convolutional network, or FCN, to classify LiDAR point cloud into different features, such as trees and buildings. Ironically, while technicians allegedly saw too much in pixels, Bayu's FCN model returned to pixels to categorize points. Extracted from LiDAR, these pixel images also act as a ground truth for Bayu to calibrate future outputs from his model. Bayu trained his model with the following two assumptions. First, a building surface comprised of LiDAR data points with similar elevation values. That is, all roofs had a similar height. Second, a building's edges had points that do not have neighboring points on all of its sides. His model then loops around these pre-given assumptions such that it outlines the edge points of a building by itself. Bayu's model attempts to articulate, formalize, and automate how data technicians draw boundaries by using heuristics. For example, if LiDAR points have higher and similar values, they represent how technicians would classify non-ground features such as roof surfaces. Distinguishing ground from non-ground at the level of every pixel, his model is considered by superiors as more precise than how technicians classify pixels. Bayu's model was so precise that his FCN model was considered erroneous when a LiDAR point belonging to a tree branch was classified as roof, given that the branch was just above a building roof. Observations that are meaningless to technicians such as the branch that lies above the building roof, have huge implications on the error rates of Bayou's FCM model. Unlike data technicians who coordinated a vision and ventured into the field to calibrate their judgment, Bayou's model relied purely on his belief that intuition can be automated and programmed to improve his model's prediction. Models that rely on heuristics and optimize its performance based on error rates, like Bayou's deep learning technique, resemble what computing scholar Dan McQuillan calls machinic Neoplatonism. Neoplatonic approaches to science aim to reveal, quote, the hidden mathematical order in the world, end quote, and go against experience. Bayou models what's out there with traces of experience, the points that can be quantified and computed in scales that exceed human apprehension. Deep learning challenged what Bayou could see and know. Quote, it's just a black box, he told me. He could only verify the model's output against the ground truth image. During one workshop, Bayou realized that his FCM model had failed to classify features unique to Indonesia, in part owing to the model's training data being generated from urban Northern Europe. He attempted to add more object classes to the ground truth image. This included unclear land and waste, categories informed by his living in Jakarta, a metropolis well known to be heavily polluted. The addition of these classes led to huge increases in classification accuracy. What was erroneous here in terms of training data was immediately redressed, fed back to the model, and iterated upon. Indeed, Bayou's fear of ground truth was of a very different kind than Munir's forest. Bayou's concern for missing training data sets is not unique to Indonesia, as experts in machine learning have cited the lack of labeled training data sets in the global south as key to biased models. As the saying goes, rubbish in and rubbish out. It's shorthand for computer scientists advocating for a greater collection of data in order to create representative prediction models. Computer scientist Amy McGovern notes that among the environmental science community, a known bias is that natural disasters are often reported in areas with higher population rates, given that more people report the sighting of such events, or that sensors are often found in such areas. In the context of Indonesia, where environmental data infrastructure as well as training data sets are still developing, a different kind of solution has been proposed: weak supervision. Unlike the commonly held belief of rubbish in and rubbish out, weak supervision flips this formula by relying less on ground truth data and expert heuristics. To overcome this lack of training data, especially when national governments in the global south embark on automated mapping projects, weak supervision promises to save costs and time. While human-labeled ground truth data is crucial for supervised learning models such as the one Bayou has developed, it is not required in weak supervision. In this way, low-quality data is said to produce high-quality predicted outputs. There are three ways to conduct weak supervision: incomplete supervision, inexact supervision, and inaccurate supervision. Incomplete supervision depends on the small amount of labeled data or using expert heuristics. Inexact supervision depends on lower resolution labels, such as label information being incomplete but addresses the task at hand. And inaccurate depends on ground truth data that may be of low quality or erroneous. Weak supervision combines these three different kinds of noisy and weakly sourced labels to make training data. Computer scientists call this process of generating large sets of labeled training data using weak supervision, data programming. What this means is that computer scientists do not need to employ annotators like Munir to collect and label data, or consult remote sensing scientists like Bayou on whether these labels were correct. They can create a set of simple programmable functions to generate labeled training data sets automatically. Here is a central issue when ground truth has shifted in meaning, and the intuition of technicians are formalized and separated from its context of practice. Both of these changes confirm what computer scientists and data science have hypothesized. Machine learning may not have changed much, but the amount and types of data have. This opens up data itself as a site of computer engineering and data programming, rather than a site for training field surveyors, cartographers, environmental scientists, and climate scientists. If training data can be programmatically made, what kind of publics are being created around a future in environmental knowledge production? Conclusion. In sum, the development in automated mapping towards weak supervision is not self-evident nor inevitable. They rely on the following two processes. First, the use of advanced remote sensing and deep learning techniques aim to separate out and formalize the technician's intuition to speed up map making. Second, the formalization of intuition legitimizes an abstracted way of knowing forest life, with implications on data annotation labor and definitions of ground truth. I'd like to spend my remaining time elaborating on my second argument, which remains speculative in nature. Perhaps one might argue that the formalization of intuition into heuristics legitimizes an abstracted way of knowing the world, especially when it imports the legitimacy of direct witnessing through the language of ground truth. What I mean by abstracted way of knowing is how ground truth in deep learning rely on the conversion of round to pixel to points as a surface for validating a predicted output. With the use of deep learning models that rely on LiDAR point cloud as a source of ground truth, errors made by a predictive model were no longer meaningful to humans. Instead, errors are used to further tune the accuracy of the model, with most of its internal states opaque to the analysis like Bayou himself. Operating at a third order remove, the formalization of intuition allows deep learning models to become legitimate precisely because the ground in which it operates has been converted into points. These points are fed into models that in turn label points anew, points train points. Unlike the field survey, ground truth is found within the image in data science, not in the forest. Deep learning models can hence predict that a forest is present in a particular site, but do not offer any explanation of why that's the case, restricting the forms of accountability they can afford. You might now ask, so what? Why does it matter that training data can now be programmed? So what if the pursuit of ground truth is increasingly reliant on ascending order of abstraction? I'll answer these two questions accordingly. First, and this brings me back to the point around weak supervision again, the devaluation of manual classification joins a broader computing effort to treat quality data annotation as an unnecessary feature of data science and computer vision. In a recent 2019 blog post made by the Stanford AI Lab blog, data and computer scientists narrowed down the bottleneck in machine and deep learning models as the reliance of these models on, quote, hand-labeled training data. They argue that these hand-labeled training sets or data annotations are expensive, time-consuming, especially when domain experts such as remote sensing scientists like Bayou or even medical professionals are needed for annotation. Because of this, ML and deep learning practitioners have turned towards weaker forms of supervision instead of purely relying on supervised learning, which, by the way, means wholly relying on hand-labeled training data sets. This weak supervision includes using small sets of labeled data or low-quality labeled data from non-experts, relying on a heuristic created by domain experts, or fine-tuning pre-trained models according to which is previously used in a different geography and domain. This meant that domain experts are no longer integral to the making of accurate data science models, but a dispensable component. Hence, the mechanization of mapping is a prelude to what has already been advocated within data science. The displacement of domain knowledge, some of which are tested, with programmable forms of data annotation is worth noting. Furthermore, the growing prominence of weak supervision further segregates the work of data collection and data analysis, where the former has astutely observed on by philosopher Holland Jane, largely performed by natives in colonies. Indeed, much of the data annotation work performed today are carried out by precarious refugees and Global South subcontracted workers. Second, the problem of abstraction in machine learning from ground to pixel to point forces us to reckon with the shifting figure and meaning of ground truth and the cost such transformations involve. In the 2021 article written by geoscientist Ian Woodhouse at the University of Edinburgh, Woodhouse urges that the remote sensing community should give up ground truth. He argues that ground truth, quote, primes us and predisposes our students to believe that the right answer, the most truthful one, is the one that's measured on the ground, not the one measured from a distance, end quote. Woodhouse elaborates that on occasion, remote sensing instruments provide a better measurement as opposed to field surveys. For example, in the case of forest canopy height or soil moisture, measurements cannot be taken directly from the ground and can only be extracted from satellite imagery. But in the same article, Woodhouse advocates to relocate the ground truth by decentering the human scale as the default scale by which we integrate the nature of our planet. Adding that ecologists have proposed the use of a macroscope instead of a microscope that will represent the biosphere of the entire planet in an unbiased scale. This argument shows how Woodhouse is convinced that a better understanding of the planet means erasing the human, with humans being the main source of bias. Perhaps it's worth considering the similarities between Woodhouse's proposal to relocate ground truth on a macro-scale farm with Bayou's abstracted form of ground truth in machine learning. Both consider that a more precise measurement of ground truth is provided by remote sensing instruments, such as the macroscope and LiDAR. Both aim to get rid of field surveys and human bias. Both advocate to scale up. Woodhouse's macroscope to take on the planetary scale and Bayou's model to be optimized through testing against other data sets to prove generalizability is similar in some ways. Yet, doing so seems to leave intact the idea that error can be resolved through technical means. Unlike in technicians' work where there's a realist impulse to uncover the truth on the ground, in deep learning, error is identified only as, quote, missing the mark. If missing the mark means abandoning the human skill like Woodhouse suggests, it gives up what feminist and post-colonial technoscience scholars have long argued. All credible knowledge are constituted by one's partial privileged perspective, which includes one's gender, race, class, national, and cultural difference. So while I empathize with Woodhouse's view that there is a fetish with ground truth, our observation, whether mediated through a macroscope or a GPS navigator, are not neutral, but theory-laden, highly material, and political. Maybe a way forward is to consider how giving up ground truth is not so much to decenter the human, but to embrace an artful living with error. As data technicians such as Munir have shown us, living with error does not stick to absolutes, but considers the contingency of everyday life and encounter. Here, error does not hinder knowledge production, nor does it serve as an aberration to what should be deemed normal. Instead, it shows us what Munir has told me a few years back in Borneo. This will do for now. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. I'll just stop sharing for now so I can see everybody's faces.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Rebecca, are you sharing the discussion?
I can do. Thanks, Cindy. That was super interesting and just such incredible data and such a lovely set of themes, and I'm very much looking forward to the book. So just a reminder to everyone, please feel free to put your questions in the chat or just raise your hand, and we've got some time for questions. I suppose I'll kick off with one while everybody's collecting their thoughts. One of the things I'd be really interested in is, to what extent do you feel that the developers are kind of do they have a sense of the technicians on the ground? Are they conscious of the decisions that they're making, or are they so focused on their version of the truth, if we like? When you talk to them, do they have a sense of the kind of human aspects of what they're doing, or their expectations of those technicians? Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Thank you for the question, Rebecca. Yes, they actually do. So in the case of Bayou, who is one of the first of scientists to introduce sort of like deep learning techniques to automate the drawing of buildings. They very much do, and in fact, I think it's quite conventional in deep learning sort of research practices to compare like man hours, right? How much hours you would take to do field surveys as compared to, say, using deep learning. And because there was so much drive to sort of remap the nation within a set number of years, because that was Indonesia's master plan, right? Remap the nation, we can help to sort of try to validate what kinds of forests we have left. There was a lot of pressure to sort of like do that kind of translational work, right? In the case of Bayou. And I think that he himself as well, maybe a few years back, have also gone on some of these field surveys, but they were never extensive like the technicians, because technicians usually spend three months doing these expeditions where they then validate this high resolution maps. Also, having to bear in mind, this is the first time that Indonesia was producing large resolution maps. So a lot of these images were very new to them, right? They've not seen images that are up close with that resolution. And so for these technicians, there was a lot of like tension around trying to figure out, oh, how much details should I actually put into these maps, right? And so a lot of that contingency, that deliberation was seen as man hours to be sort of in some ways calculated and replaced by deep learning techniques. So this was done in parallel. So one did not necessarily replace the other. And there's still, sort of ongoing negotiation about what features can be automated in the case of Indonesia. For what I know about London, base maps are actually automated. So I'm not so sure about that ethnographic experience there. But yeah, thanks for that question.
That's great, thank you. I just think it's so interesting, these kind of global narratives of kind of automation or augmentation and how those things kind of fit together with expertise. And so that's just so interesting. I'll hand over to David now, who has a question, I think.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, what I want to say, so first of all, I want to say thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. I want to throw some names at you as kind of parallels, really, and then make a general point. So the first person I started thinking about was Antonia Walford at UCL, who works on environmental data collection in the Amazon. Then this is a bit random, I should warn you. Then there's Peter Gallison, the historian of science.
Not random at all.
Yeah, excellent. So fascinating film about the visualization of a black hole, where of course there's no possibility of doing ground truthing. And so one of the things that they did was split the data programmers into 3 different groups who were ring-fenced. So I think that might be an instance of weak supervision, I now realize. Then kind of, I was also thinking of the Borges short story about the map of the empire at 1-to-1 and the impossibility of making a 1-to-1 map. Any map has to be abstracted. And so then one more quote, one more person to evoke, the old saying, map is not territory. But I have just looked up the original source for that. It's Alfred Korzybski, and the quote is, which I'd forgotten this, mistake the map for the territory, mistake a philosophical system for the world, and the map will over-determine the inquiry. And I think that kind of is a nice segue to my actual point, which is that I think it's important to distinguish incompleteness from error.
Mm.
And that since any map has to be incomplete, there's a question about what sort of incompleteness is being accepted. And turning that on its head, what's the purpose of the map? You could contrast the maps made for pilots of Indonesia with the maps made for people on boats. And of course, all sorts of stuff is in one, not the other. And those aren't errors. They are features, they are results of, as it were, the politics and the planned intended utility, which I think kind of frames what you're talking about somewhat differently. Let me put it like that and then let you respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much for thinking with me in such a quick time. And I really appreciate those not random references. And absolutely, a map always depends on how you use it, right? A map is made according to its utility. And in fact, one thing I'm trying to still trace out, David, is the two different camps in Indonesia's history of cartography. There were a bunch of Indonesian data remote sensing scientists and mappers that were trained by the Americans who were advocating for the computerization of mapping. And then there were those who were sent to Germany, and some of them sent to the Netherlands, who have some tensions with the Germans in terms of map making, who are very much obsessed with a kind of exactness, especially when it comes to figuring out the projection of the maps and the accuracy, the positional accuracy of the maps. So there was one that was very much into how do we transform paper maps into digital maps. And then the other one was very much still obsessed with the positional accuracy. And this was playing out in the National Mapping Agency in Indonesia, right? And the person that I was hanging out with was very much of the former. He was trained at Purdue University. He's one of the first photogrammetrists in Indonesia. He came back to Bandung after 1965. And it's a very rich story because his point is always like your point. His point was like, the map, it doesn't matter if the map is incomplete. It matters how you use it, right? And so he was always in contestation with some of the directors of the National Mapping Agency that were trained by the Germans and the Dutch, who said that, no, we need an exact projection. We need more of this positional accuracy. We really need the field surveyors to really have a one-to-one. So there was this tension that was unfolding in the post-colonial nation that was trying to figure out how to make these maps, because these maps, if I've not mentioned at all in this presentation, will, for a good amount of 30 years after Dutch colonization, actually closed up and sort of protected by the military officers. They were not a scientific expertise. So there was a lot of this trying to figure out, at this exact moment, how do we actually make a map? So sort of, our conversation here is exactly what they are talking about in those offices back in Bandung. And I really appreciate you actually bring this out, because it's something that I'm still trying to work out, especially when this language of ground truth is being used by machine learning practitioners who are now also doing the kind of remote sensing work that some of the scientists are doing. And I actually appreciate the sort of the one-to-one kind of story by Borges, because it really felt like that was what some of the scientists were so interested in trying to achieve, which I found it really interesting, because for a lot of remote sensing scientists and cartographers in America here that I interact with for my newest fieldwork, they'll very much say the same thing as you say. So it's really interesting to see this other camp of people actually trying to say that, look, we need exactness here. And I think it's a lot to do with the physical quality of some of these remote sensing images that have really transformed over the years. Yeah, that'll be my short answer to you. Thank you so much, though. This is really good.
Can I just jump in and just point out that there are 2 questions in the chat, one from Elizabeth and one from Adrian. If maybe I'll read the first one from Elizabeth, if that's okay. Elizabeth says, "Thank you. This is an important study in and of itself. I wonder, did you broker any conversations around the relative value of these different knowledge positions from a cost-benefit perspective or something else?"
Yeah, that's an interesting question to ask. I still haven't quite figured out whether one way is better than the other. And I hesitate as well. I think a lot of people who do both methods, right? We can think about them as like the quantitative, the qualitative camera, although I'm using shorthand here, it's not exactly like that. I kind of want to like stay away from, comparing these 2 methods as incommensurable, kind of. But I realized that, in actually writing about it this way, it might look that way. I haven't done a cost and benefit analysis of these different methodologies. A lot of this data science train of scientists, as I've mentioned to Rebecca, they have done it. They have done it according to this idea of like, okay, look at how much man hours, how much computer hours we are saving, how much does this translate to like actual price or wages for paying these people, and then what would this look like for national mapping and planning, right, for a developing nation. So from that perspective, they have definitely done that, but not so much from the people who are doing like manual mapping in any sense. So yeah, it's something to think about. Also, both on a much more larger scale, right? Like, what do I do when I put these different methodologies in sort of in a story, like what kind of tensions do they represent?
I guess because the way that you're looking at it is thinking about the different actors, and the cost benefit for them is something that you could do in your study. But I'm also thinking from a much wider sort of anthropological perspective, what's at stake here? How could we really think about what's at stake with using these 2 sort of getting at the paradigms behind the methods and understanding what impact that might have.
I think what at stake here was what I was trying to sort of show in that weak supervision methodology, right? When intuition becomes formalized into these heuristics that are then used to train, say, like a deep learning model to automate the delineation of these buildings. And also the narrative, the rhetoric around some of these global South nations, that they don't have benchmark data, they don't have enough training data sets that are annotated, they don't have national inventories, right? Those, you can think back, right? They would say that you don't have national inventories for first. And so one way we can help you to address this gap is that now we can use weak supervision to create predictive models that can help you to save man hours, cost hours. You can help, you can help to move away this reliance on geospatial data technicians to make national maps. And the cost here really is this. I feel for me, this is kind of worrying to see domain expertise kind of being sidelined, right? When you have no radiologists to work alongside computer scientists, and you have computer scientists trying to reformat, which is something that I'm trying to work on right now in my recent field work, reformat satellite imagery, which, by the way, is a very robust and rich image source. It's not a JPEG, it's not a BNG. Each pixel itself can tell you the spectral signature of soil, or can tell you how tall a tree is. They're trying to reformat that into computer vision frameworks that work very differently, and in fact reduces that amount of information to something compact that they can then use to efficiently train models. I think that's what's at stake, right? That you have a whole bunch industry that's well trained and specialized to understand landscapes, right? Whether it be mapping or climate modeling. And now you have a bunch of computer scientists saying, look, we don't need to do, we need to bring in AI and data science into these domains. And then at the same time, you also don't need domain expertise anymore. So not only just the potential displacement of data technicians, right, but also the potential sidelining of domain expertise like environmental scientists. I find that worrying, because what kind of publics, right, can we bring around something so opaque and something so black box that now is increasingly not sort of reliant on annotators, right? We can't even mobilize annotators to say, oh, we are paid unfairly, for example. So maybe that's something that I'm trying to think through. Yeah, this sticks, but that's a perfect question.
Thank you.
Super interesting, thank you. We have another question in the chat from Adrian, which I'll read out. And Adrian, feel free to chip in as well, if that's helpful. So he says, thank you very much for the insightful talk. Oh, hi, Adrian. Do you want to ask your question yourself, or shall I read it out?
Oh, yeah, sure. Hi, Cindy. Thanks for another
Thank you for
insightful
coming
talk.
again, Adrian.
Yeah, I'm very concerned with Dr. Woodhouse's idea that you cited, that the truth should not be what's surveyed on the ground, and instead it should be sifted to what's measurable from the satellites. And I think, yeah, access to remotely sensed data is controlled by the global north, despite the fact that many of them are currently freely accessible, and thus defining the truth as something measured from exclusively from the remote sensing data and not what's found on the ground could be then unfair to the global south countries who has relatively better and more guaranteed access to the ground. Did I miss?
Absolutely. No,
Okay.
that is great. You completely, you helped me to complete this talk. And you are trained in peatland fires prediction, right? If I'm not wrong.
That will be my PhD study, but I did my master's study in remote land cover mapping.
Yeah, and people like you are absolutely the people I want to speak to, because the environmental scientists are actually very concerned about sort of this movement of, or like redefinition of ground truth, right? That's not only happening through the introduction of machine learning into mapping, but also within the remote sensing community itself, as higher resolution satellite images are being controlled and by the European Space Agency, which by the way still doesn't do open source imagery, unlike Landsat data from NASA, which by the way is also not very high resolution and has a lot of cloud cover in the tropics, right? All kinds of reasons, but there have been projects, I would say here, there's in a way that maybe complicates, not so much denies your point, but complicates what we think about the global north and south. So in the 80s, the Dutch actually had come up with a very interesting satellite sensor. And I actually read this in one of the archives in the National Institute of Aeronautics and Space back in Jakarta in Indonesia. I read this in their library. In the 80s, the Netherlands actually came up with, I think it's called the Tropical Earth Observation Monitoring Satellite Sensor. And they wanted to really address this problem, right, of omission, right? Because a lot of the satellite sensors we have today don't necessarily do very well in places that are cloudy, which are mostly the tropics. And they were trying to find a way to create a satellite sensor that could penetrate some of this cloud cover and also provide better imagery for remote sensing scientists in Indonesia. So there were efforts to do these things as well, but they often are not done because of cost issues, which we can think why. And the issue of expertise, they would say that, oh, there's not enough trained expertise in Indonesia to help us to monitor and continue to operate the systems, right? And I think fundamentally, I feel like there's a lot of these gaps and deficiencies they are pointing out when they want to create such a great system that promises to be equitable. But it always comes down to the idea that, there's not enough scientific infrastructures in the global south. And I find it very sad when I say things like that, but I also say that there are efforts and there's often less, so West versus the rest kind of thing, like, that all kinds of decision making being made on the ground, even from elites in Indonesia, as to why they don't want to invest in such a project, right? They might invest in their own resource exploitation. So back to you, like I'm really glad you're here, because I'm often like a different insight into a different kind of project to you. So I'm curious to hear what you think, either via email or something else. Yeah.
I'll learn to put my mic on at some point, but thanks, Adrian. That was a great question. And we've also got some lovely comments in the chat just saying how much they enjoyed your presentation and found it very insightful. I'd really like to it's maybe more of a a question, thinking about the kind of conceptual frame, and I really love this notion of weak supervision. And what I like most about it is it's kind of a really important metaphor as well as something that's actually happening in kind of data science world. It kind of it carries across in a really interesting way. And I was just wondering if you could just give us a little bit more about how you came to weak supervision as the kind of frame, and how that happened across the time of your study. I just think it's super interesting.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it gives me more space to say things that I couldn't present in a short period of time without losing all of your focuses and attention. I came to weak supervision in a recent fieldwork that I've been doing with an American NGO that's working with some of the more prominent venture philanthropy in the world. I will not mention who, and also some of the largest big tech companies. And this American NGO has been contracted by various government agencies, such as in South Africa, in the Western Cape State Department of Agriculture, India, and also in Vanuatu, to basically find ways to reduce the costs required to make maps of land. So similar story here, right? So a lot of nation states are finding ways to, how do we save costs in making maps so that we can know the crop estimates of our current export, right? In the case of South Africa, that was the case, right? They wanted to figure out how much crops we have left that we can export to other countries. And a lot of the reasoning that they wanted to automate this, at least from the government's point of view, was that there wasn't enough annotated data sets. There wasn't a legacy of inventory of some of these maps that could be readily used, right? And I would say that in the case here, the US is also the same. So this is not unique exactly to the Global South, right? I said that this was the reasoning that was provided. And so one of the proposals was to use weak supervision, right? Precisely because it could help to do that job. And also a very interesting thing I want to say is that without using so much data, for example, weak supervision, one of the methods is incomplete supervision, which means using a small amount of labeled training data sets, and the rest is unlabeled training data. They see this as a way, the people who are building it, as sort of overcoming privacy concerns when it comes to stuff like imagery, right? So this is interesting for me because I'm trying to figure that out as well. So, and this is obviously very of interest definitely to a lot of people who have been instituting or legislating privacy rights in nation states. But points, they could say, they could, without having to label these data sets, they could sort of overcome privacy concerns. And it got me really interested. Wow, this is such an interesting flip in logic of things I've heard always time and time again. You need good qualitative data. I mean, this also happens for ethnography, right? You need good quality data, long continuous fieldwork, right? Let's go there, make sure we have ground truth so that we can validate our narrative, or in the case here, our maps. But now they're saying, look, we don't need that much data, annotated data. And in fact, we can overcome privacy concerns. This is very appealing to government officials who, A, don't want to put in so much money, or probably don't have sufficient resources to put in money for either making censuses or agriculture estimates yearly or every 5 years, right? So this was definitely seen as a gateway for helping to complete some of the very fundamental instruments that need to legitimize the state itself. So yeah, I got to that story there and sort of try to connect the pieces with what I've been really seeing in Indonesia, where methods to implement weak supervision is not so much, at least for I know now, not so much integral to the story yet, but I could see that sort of forthcoming. Yeah.
That is fascinating, and the flip towards a kind of benefit for privacy, I think, is so interesting. So my field is more in education, and so there's also problems with like lots of incomplete data and very little data, you know, to run the kinds of models people want. And so the solution so far has been to just take more data, but of course that always feels very extractive and kind of problematic. So this notion of kind of flipping it through this method is super interesting. Oh, thank you. That's great. I will.
Yeah, and the first time I heard it, I was like, wow, this sounds promising. So actually, I don't have a story yet really on my hand, even though I mentioned the stakes of the project earlier to Elizabeth. Like, I sometimes hesitate because I also want to see what new possibilities emerge out of this, right? Which is often, it's never a yes or no, kind of thing. Is always this, is multifaceted, it's polysemous. So I kind of just want to see how it goes.
That's so interesting. I'm just going to pause here to see if anyone else would like to ask a question, because otherwise I'll just keep asking things I'm interested in.
Well, can I jump in?
Of course you can, David. Please
I'm
do.
going to a subversive thought is that, what do I want to say? Okay, so one ethnographic solution to privacy concerns, radical privacy concerns, is to fictionalize and say, in effect, I am writing an ethnographic novel. There are no individual in my account corresponds to a live individual, but I have interacted with lots of live individuals, and I am, what do I want to say, condensing, summarizing what I have learnt through these fictional people. The results of weak supervision, in one sense, are similar to that, it seems to me. And the worry, the challenge would be, these are artifacts. And so somewhere in the debate would be a debate about the status of the results, would be some sort of implicit recourse to realism, which ends up being resolved by saying, but look, there is no house there, there is no forest in this specific location. How do you know? Well, I've been there, or I am calling you from a phone from that location. So you might be able to postpone a recourse to ground truth, but it's only a postponement, I would think.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing that I'm struggling, sort of like what I was saying just now to back up, is that, there was there's a tension here in which I'm trying not to say that, well, the field technicians are doing their job better, right? I'm very hesitant to say exactly that. I'm just saying that they're producing very different kinds of effects onto the wall. And I very much worry about this recourse to realism, right? To say that, look, we can go out into the field and this is the right thing. And especially if you think about it in terms of pedagogically, if you're teaching students how to do ethnography today, and this is something I'm curious to hear what people think here, I was just talking about this exactly last week with a few colleagues at Cornell Tech about this issue around data ethics when it comes to scraping data online. And how do we ensure the privacy of these individuals if it's a public forum? Obviously, this is an age-old debate for people who are specialized exactly in these methods. But I'm very curious about that, and I think a lot of it is because, and maybe this is my own naivete, but anthropologists have a history and commitment to kind of reflexivity that I'm not so sure if data scientists do. And in fact, actually, computer scientists is a very recent profession. People often think of them as like a long profession because so much emphasis is placed on them, but compare geodesists, one of the oldest science in the world, and computer science, like this is gonna take a long time. But the effect, the sort of ways in which that is being implemented at such a large scale now is worrying, right? The speed at which one is completely encroaching onto another discipline is worrying. So I'm curious also maybe to flip the question back to all of you. How do you teach students about digital ethnography, right? And how does that speak to the larger discipline itself? Is that, as my own naivete saying that, anthropologists actually has like a larger sort of like commitment to a kind of reflexive writing culture that is different from, say, data ethics, data scientists, sorry. Is that right for me to postulate? Or
I suppose, yes. And I suppose, the main thing I'd want to say in response to that we do say is that although we don't say you have to put yourself into the ethnography, at least in the center of the ethnography, the one thing you should always be aware of is that you cannot remove yourself from it.
Mm.
And you have to accept your positionality. I mean, as you said right at the start, really. And part of the point of method is to try and deal with kind of some kind of obvious forms of bias. So you may only want to talk to people who are like you. Well, one way round that is to force yourself to talk to a random selection of people. All those sorts of techniques, but that doesn't mean that you can ever reduce your positionality to zero. And it's just that recognition is utterly key. What else would I want to say? There was something else, but it's now gone. I don't know if Rebecca wants to say anything in response to that.
Well, I feel a bit of a fraud because I don't do much actual ethnography, as you know, but I don't know if Bill or Thomas would like to come in. They'd be better placed, I think, given they teach digital ethnography.
Oh boy. I don't have a very good response. I mean, mine is to sort of throw my responses to how to teach it, kind of ethics and establish the importance of positionality and so on. Just throw more readings at them and say this has the answers. But yeah, I mean, really, I don't have much more, except I have plenty of anecdote that I could throw in, but I fully agree with what David is saying. There's a book that I was recently reading called, actually I have it in front of me, called From Notes to Narrative. I think it's a really fantastic and really accessible book. The byline to the book is writing ethnographies that everyone can read. And I think the point of that's made in a few chapters, and why I find it kind of persuasive, dovetailing off of what David was saying, is that she takes the position that even if you don't owe it to your informants, to be honest and to write well, you owe it to your reader, and it just makes for a better read. And so yeah, you cannot remove yourself from the flow of events, but even if you could, you wouldn't want to.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Yeah, go ahead.
You go ahead, Cindy. You go ahead.
I just want to add a quick note here. And then maybe Adrian would say something as well. But actually, remote sensing scientists, when they were asking me to give them a talk about AI ethics to them, right? Giving some of my dissertation work to them, they mentioned that, and this is not to say that the IRB in America is perfect, but they actually say they don't have to do an IRB when they were doing remote sensing data analysis because they were not studying people. Right. So anyway, just an anecdotally thing, which is so different from, say, in anthropology, where yes, there's a sort of commitment to say that you cannot remove yourself from the field, right? Or at least as written as a way to remind the practitioner that that is a commitment that you have, kind of like sign yourself up for. But yeah, I wonder what Elizabeth wanted to say.
Yeah, super interesting. Elizabeth, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking about, I mean, obviously we all agree that we can't write ourselves out of our ethnographies or our accounts. And I think that is the baseline position in anthropology. But when you're working with other people, you're co-producing knowledges, or you have a lot of different stakeholders who you've intimately consulted sort of along the way, your position isn't so clear because there's a whole load of negotiated and consulted positions along the way. And how do you account for, I wonder, how do you account for all of those different positions, as well as sort of expressing your own position and sort of being authentic and all the rest of it to oneself as well as for the reader? And we can't write it. It's the same with it. We're part of the apparatus that we're using to do the study, right? That's what we acknowledge, which perhaps more positivistic sciences won't accept or don't want to look at or don't agree with that position. So there's a double challenge, isn't there? That challenge of thinking, first of all, just the fact that I'm acknowledging that I've influenced the process or the outputs of my results, and that also lots of other people who I've talked to have shaped my thinking and changed my position along the way. And then the other issue of, and this is completely different to how you might think about what is valid or evidence, or what counts as a robust approach. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the question of positionality is always interesting, right? Because I've not mentioned anything about methods here at all, but I spent my time, so this was earlier field work that I've done in 2017, 2016, and I think parts of 2018 as well. And it was actually sort of trying to figure out the sort of practices that went into this policy in Indonesia called One Map policy. As I mentioned, the contestation was around that there were differing forest estimates, but also boundaries of primary forest in Papua Island. And that set off this incident where the Indonesian government decided that we need to remap the nation with a topographic map so that it serves as a standard reference that every ministry has to follow right now. So no more conflicting land tenures for, you have to follow this one map, basically, this idea of this one map, which is so interesting. I got really interested, like, who is making this one map? So as a Chinese Singaporean, which is interesting in and of itself, right? Singaporean being more privileged country than Indonesia, but Chinese having its own history of persecution and discrimination in Indonesia meant that I sort of embody this tension-filled position, and I also often pass as just Indonesian. And I was sitting in this government offices, which is very rare to have access to as a foreigner. But because I passed so well and I could speak Indonesian language, they're like, yeah, she could be like a consultant or something like that. And so when I was curious to figure out like who exactly were making these maps, and I was surprised, me being a completely clueless student, that it was not scientists in this fancy office making maps of one Indonesia, right? They're so alluring. You keep thinking there's going to be this thing, and then they say, oh, well, actually we subcontracted this map makings to this data technicians like a few hours in this other city somewhere else. And I was like, oh, really? And then I was invited there, and sure enough, it was not less fancy, it's still fancy, in this sort of urban city in Bandung, where I met this very impressive remote sensing scientist who was trained in Purdue, and it really set forth this whole project of like who exactly, sort of making visible the labor that was contributing to this very alluring project, right, to remap the nation. So yeah, it's a positionality that I reckon with much more in a different sort of project that I presented elsewhere, where I was studying these two government institutions who are trying to figure out how to predict peatland fires in Indonesia. And that is a very contentious issue in Indonesia, mainly because palm oil corporations have cleared large swaths of land, and palm oil corporations are often associated with Chinese Indonesians who own them. And so there were all kinds of like associations that came with my presence in these government offices, staring at what they were doing and documenting it. At some point when COVID-19 broke out in March 2020, I received a message to tell me to not come to the office anymore because my identity as a Singaporean, because then Indonesian had not reported any COVID cases. They said that my identity as a Singaporean who already had multiple cases in their homeland would serve as a trigger to large other government ministries to say that you've let a foreigner come into your offices. So yeah, it's something that I'm still working out. I'm planning to do a workshop later on this summer to invite some of my interlocutors, presenting some of these things, and also just getting them to tell me more about things that they have done. So yeah, it's really interesting. It's an important question. Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And also, I think the work that you do in translating kind of data science approaches and thinking about it from a kind of more humanities and social science perspective is really unique, that you can switch between those those kind of understandings and stories as well. I think that's really important and really powerful part of the work. I think it's really interesting. I'm conscious of time. I think we're almost out of time, but I just want to check, has anybody else got any last question or comment that they'd like to make? No? All right, well, it just leaves me, I think, and David and everyone just to thank Cindy so much. In fact, it's just been a really fascinating talk, and we're very much looking forward to reading the book when it's out. Do you have a publication date, or is it still in progress?
Oh dear, still in progress.
Okay, as all good books should be.
Can we all unmute our microphones and give Cindy a round of applause?
And the recording will be up hopefully by the end of the week, but maybe it'll be next week. But anyway, the recording will be up.